Water, the basic life-giving force of our planet. It is a substance crucial to our survival, and as such, is an element we are naturally drawn to. It is also an element that can take life as easily as it sustains it. A hurricane submerges Toronto in a raging torrent of floodwater, washing away entire homes and families. In Hawaii, a tsunami leaps from the depths of the Pacific Ocean, laying waste to the coastal town of Hilo in a matter of moments. Two humbling moments in human history where human lives were simply washed away. (1960). Located amidst the tranquil rivers and lush vegetation of Hawaii is the town of Hilo. Known for its fishing and its sugar plantations, Hilo is an unassuming city of a few thousand.
Sugar was still reigning as king over here. We had like 30 sugar plantations. Hilo was at that time still the second largest city in the state, and it was a real bustling economy here. It was still a rather sleepy little community.
If you zip through town at 55 miles per hour, you miss everything.
At that time, life was plain and simple, nothing fancy. It's a big city, and yet it's a small place.
Another more unsettling characteristic of Hilo is its vulnerability to tsunami activity.
Hilo has the distinction, they laughingly call us the tsunami capital of the world.
Primarily the last 200 years, there have been about 10 major deadly tsunamis hit the Hawaiian Islands and caused more damage, more lives lost in Hilo than anywhere else.
On April Fool's Day, 1946, Hilo was struck by the worst tsunami in its history. A landslide occurs off the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Minutes later, a tsunami wave crashes into Hilo, claiming 96 lives and causing millions of dollars in damage. Yet despite Hilo's history of tsunamis, the inhabitants of the island lead peaceful, normal lives. Living near the Waikare Peninsula, a half-mile from the ocean, 29-year-old physics teacher Suichi Tanaka lives with his wife Moira, a public health nurse, and his father in a 3-bedroom house. Janet Kinoshita, a doctor's nurse who lives with her parents and younger brother, is excitedly preparing for a friend's wedding shower. Richard Nakamura, a sales manager at an automobile company, enjoys the day at the baseball park. Florence Kalikoa is looking after her 3 children, while her husband, a fisherman, is away at sea. Susan Maeda's mind is far from the dangers posed by the sea, having just begun the 1st grade. But unbeknownst to the residents of Hilo, their fate has already been set into motion by events thousands of miles away. On May 22, 1960, the worst earthquake of the 20th century occurs along Chile's southern coast. The shock wave is so severe that it cannot be measured within the 8 points of the Richter scale and leaves Chile in ruins. In addition to the colossal damage caused by the quake, another equally devastating phenomenon known as a tsunami develops beneath sea level.
A tsunami is a series of waves in the ocean caused by some disturbance, generally caused by an underwater earthquake.
Due to the severity of the Chilean quake, the seafloor drops several meters, causing a wave effect or tsunami to form on the surface of the ocean, directly above the center of the shock wave.
A piece of real estate the size of the state of California moved 8 to 10 meters high. So you can imagine the size of the motion of the seafloor, and that triggered a large tsunami.
The immediate effect of the tsunami is felt as the first of the 2 waves emanating from its epicenter hit the Chilean coast. But its impact is largely overshadowed by the destruction caused by the quake itself. The second wave moves into the open Pacific Ocean. Upon hitting the deeper water of the open seas, the wave literally disappears.
It very rapidly spreads out and smooths out into a wave that is so low but so long that no one has ever seen a tsunami wave in the open ocean.
Seismographs at the Tsunami Warning Station in Honolulu pick up the Chilean quake at 6:45 local time and immediately issue a tsunami warning for the Hawaiian Islands. Warnings of potential tsunami activity are issued for the Tahitian and Hawaiian island chains, including Hilo. Yet in spite of its history, news of the potential tsunami is met largely with apathy in Hilo.
The residents of Hilo did not expect a large tsunami coming in so close to the 1946 tsunami. At that time, we used to think that tsunamis maybe struck once every 100 years. So most people at Hilo were probably skeptical.
The warning system was already developed, but there had been so many false alarms and so many problems with that system because it was in its infancy. And people just didn't realize what the danger was still yet.
These sentiments are shared by Moira Tanaka and her husband Suichi.
I remember being at home and neighbors talking about it. And then, of course, in the evening, just being glued to the radio and listening to the happenings of the wave at various parts of at different locations.
Others, like Janet Kinoshita, find their thoughts preoccupied with other things as the warnings are issued.
It was a beautiful day that day. I went to work as usual, but that evening we were going to have a wedding shower for my girlfriend. And we ended up at Moto's Inn.
Like so many other children, 6-year-old Susan Maeda and her younger brother find no cause for alarm.
It was a very normal day, and I think up until bedtime it was, we were very casual about it. I think we were watching TV and I think my parents were kind of watching but not overly concerned.
Janet's brother Bert Kinoshita and his friend Clarence return from a day's fishing in the bay, seemingly oblivious to any warnings. Others find the news of potential tsunamis more of an inconvenience than a worry, such as Richard Nakamura, owner of Hilo Motors.
I was at the ballpark, and the siren blew. And it's customary, in fact, it was almost mandatory in the part of most companies, that you go to the employment area and you do what needs to be done. In our case, we had automobiles, so we were supposed to move them to higher grounds, but maybe it was me at that, forget it. Never did that one time.
3 geologists from the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory see the potential tsunami as an opportunity to observe this strange phenomenon and position themselves at a safe vantage point to do just that. Without tidal gauges to the south, officials are unable to track the movement or severity of the tsunami as it moves across the Pacific. Instead, they must rely on visual reports from Tahiti and Christmas Island to the south. Given that all previous tsunamis originated in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands to the north, there is no tsunami monitoring equipment to the south, as no one had anticipated a tsunami approaching from that direction. Warning sirens are sounded on Hilo at 8:30 that night.
When some people did start to evacuate, some were mocked, some were made fun of. It was kind of like teasing. Why are you guys leaving? Some pointed to areas where 1946 had came and said, oh look, the water only came this high in 1946. We're safe.
Arriving home from the wedding shower at Moto's Inn, Janet Kinoshita decides to heed the warnings.
My brother, he lived on higher grounds, so he told us that we should just pack whatever we could, important papers and all, and just go with him and stay overnight at his place. Well, My mom said, no, no, no. I think this is going to be another one of those warnings that it's going to be a false alarm. So he said, if you folks want to go, you go. But he said, I'm sick and tired of running away from this kind of stuff.
By 9 p.m., the tsunami arrives in Tahiti. Observers report the waves to be a meager 3 feet high. Islanders breathe a tense sigh of relief, convinced that the warnings are just another false alarm, prompting people to ignore the alarm whistles that continue to blare.
We've been in tidal wave sections, but it never comes up, The water never reaches us. But the whistle kept blowing from 10 o'clock, it blows, And my kids went to bed. And my neighbor says, oh, don't go anywhere, it's not gonna come.
Any lingering fears are allayed when the tsunami reaches Christmas Island at around 11 p.m. that evening. Again, waves of only a few feet are reported. Convinced that this warning is yet another in a string of false alarms, many turn in for the night.
We remained awake and listening to the radio until we heard that the wave was only 1 foot at Christmas Island. And that's when we decided that it probably would not come to Hilo, and therefore decided to go to bed.
Several people who have gathered to watch the tsunami talk and laugh. It's more a social gathering than a tsunami watch, with reports from Tahiti and Christmas Island. Yet, despite the reports, others remain unsettled by the day's events. Among them, Florence Kelikoa.
The whistle kept blowing, 11 o'clock, kept blowing. Then I say to myself, gee, I feel hot, There's something that's really, I'm not satisfied with myself, the feeling I have.
What experts fail to realize is that both Tahiti and Christmas Island are surrounded by underwater reefs, which greatly depleted the tsunami's power as it moved inland. Hilo Bay has no such protection.
The coastline north of Hilo town is very abrupt. As the waves hit that, they tend to be reflected toward Hilo. As they get nearer to Hilo and they combine with the waves that are coming in directly, they may add up and make even higher waves than would be true in other places. This makes this more susceptible place, and Hilo is the place in the Pacific that we measure other tsunamis by.
Most of the residents of Hilo are ignorant to the fact that a large tsunami is very much on its way, and nothing can stop it. As midnight falls in Hilo on May 22, 1960, those still awake turn their thoughts from tsunamis to the work week ahead. On the Wailuku River Bridge, the geologists begin to think of calling it quits when something happens. The water under the bridge crests 4 feet above normal. At a few minutes past midnight, the first wave of the tsunami has arrived at Hilo Bay.
They saw waves coming up and receding, small waves going up and down. So they thought very little about a possible tsunami.
Over the next 45 minutes, the water level begins to recede. The geologists record a 4-foot drop in the Wailuku River before it starts to rise again, a telltale sign that a tsunami is underway. Others, feeling uneasy about the fluctuating water levels, begin to act.
The neighbor, Mr. Suihiro, had come by and was talking to my father, and Mr. Suihiro had some concerns because the water was starting to recede. He thought that he would evacuate, thought that maybe that's something we might consider too, and with that, my parents decided, yeah, maybe we should.
Plagued by an uneasy feeling all night, Florence Kelikoa decides to move her 3 kids to higher ground. Along the way, she runs into a neighbor with her children.
My neighbor said she wanted to see tidal waves, so if I could take the girls with me, walk where I'm going to walk, you know. And she has 5 girls, you know, 4 girls at that time. So I took her girls with me.
Moments later, an alert goes out over the police radio band, warning of the very real threat of an impending tsunami. Police begin moving curious onlookers away from the shoreline, among them Richard Nakamura.
I moved to a place about 160 steps further up by this little bridge. Because I did that, the whole gang went with me, thinking that the police officer told us to move up.
At 12:46 a.m., the second tsunami wave hits. This one decidedly more powerful than the first. From his new vantage point, Richard Nakamura watches the spectacle unfold before him.
The water comes up, overflow, a lot of fish comes up. People used to pick it up and take it home for eating. Then it recedes to empty and goes back and forth for 3 or 4 times.
The ebb and flow of the second wave causes little damage, but the nagging feeling begins to get the better of more and more people.
I heard the water or the wave, and that's when I decided to, get up, and we decided that we should evacuate.
Fuseo Ito finds herself waiting out the potential tsunami among friends.
Her friends who still lived in the old neighborhood came to her house and they said, Mrs. Ito, we're going to stay with you this evening because you live in a safe place.
The Maeda family also opts to evacuate, at least to the end of their cul-de-sac near the Wailuku River.
There were a lot of people out there and kind of looking at the river and, talking story, like neighbors getting together. But it was, the feeling was unusual in that it was kind of hushed.
Over the next 15 minutes, the water level begins to recede. The geologists note a dizzying drop of 7 feet in the Wailuku River, followed by an eerie calm that descends upon Hilo.
When nothing else happened by 1 o'clock, a lot of people, most people thought it was over, and there were people who were returning to their homes at 1 because they just sort of used that as, if nothing has happened, it must be over.
Fuseo Ito once again finds herself alone as her friends return to their own homes.
She was standing at her screen door and watching as her friends left to walk back. They're walking back down toward the river.
At around 1 a.m., the silence is broken.
From afar, I could hear this sound that it sounded like a jet plane was, starting. The engine was starting, getting closer.
It is the sound of the third and final wave forming in the darkness of Hilo Bay.
Suddenly, out of nowhere, I started to hear this roaring sound, like a huge jet at a distance coming towards us.
Those with the best perspective of the wave are those on the bridge.
As our eyes searched for the source of the ominous noise, a pale wall of tumbling water, the broken crest of the third wave, advanced and seemed to grow in height as it moved steadily toward the heart of the city. At 1:04 a.m., the 20-foot-high, nearly vertical front of the inrushing bore churned past our lookout, and we ran a few hundred feet toward safer ground.
Somebody, I don't know who, screamed, telling us that, run. From there we ran up. I ran on which there were hundreds of people panicking.
A 30-foot wall of water, known as a bore, surges into Hilo at speeds of over 30 miles an hour.
A tidal bore is when a wave becomes steeper and steeper because the top part is moving faster than the bottom, which is being slowed down by friction. This finally forms a very steep wave, which eventually may collapse in front of itself, doing even more damage.
The peaceful scene on the beach quickly erupts into chaos.
A man yelled out, "Big wave!" People started panicking, just running. My dad grabbed me by the hand and we ran.
In my pajamas, I looked out in the veranda. About half-mile away from our home was this utility company, and there was this tremendous short circuit, and the whole town was lighted by this green light. And I said to myself, gee whiz, are we gonna die?
The whole town went black. Big crackling sound, the whole electricity was out. And you can hear the unreal noise of the wave coming in.
Safely on higher ground, Florence Kalikoa tries to keep her neighbor's children and her own occupied as the wave strikes Hilo.
And I could feel that ground shaking, like, you know, that earth move. You feel that earth move. You feel like it's thundering under the ground.
The city is suddenly plunged into darkness, further adding to the hysteria. Others don't even have a chance to respond.
Standing there, clinging, all of a sudden the water is rising. Then you feel that water rising, and you wonder, when it's gonna stop? Is it gonna stop now?
My dad said, oh, you know, maybe this is it, probably, you know, so we all hold hands together, and if we should die, then we can find everybody together.
Drawn to the door by the noise of the wave, Fuseo Ito barely has time to comprehend what is happening before her world is turned upside down.
The next thing she knows, the wave hits her house. And when she comes to, she finds herself on her screen door floating up and down the river.
Susan Maeda's father wastes no time getting his family to higher ground.
We could see the water. It was a wall of water. It's not even a wave, it's a wall, is what it looked like. And it just picked people up.
Also trying to escape by car are the Tanakas, but they can't outrun the advancing wave.
The waves hit us, but we were in a car. And somehow the wave kept pushing us, and suddenly it just shoved us right up against this tiny monkey pod tree.
We got out of the car and we hurriedly climbed the tree.
Trapped by the rising water, the Kinoshitas find their minds racing to comprehend a way out of the situation.
And my mom couldn't swim. She just was ready to faint, so I slapped her, you know. I said, Mom, you can't go like this. Wake up, you know. And she said, oh, she's getting all worked up, you know. And my father is yelling at her, see, because of you, this is what's happening to us. So I'm telling him, quiet now. The only thing we can do now is to pray.
Seconds pass like minutes as the crest of the bore reaches its peak. Then, slowly, the wave finally begins to ebb. The worst of the tsunami is over. In the darkness, people can only imagine the scene in Hilo as they wait for daybreak. May 23rd, 1960. Survivors attempt to make sense of the alien landscape around them. Beneath the rubble lay 61 dead and 55 injured in one of the worst tsunamis in recorded history.
The worst of those waves had enough energy in them to move boulders from the breakwater that weighed several tons. It had enough energy to move cars, trucks. It tosses those things around like they were toys.
Rescue crews set to work in the inundated area, slowly slogging their way through the wreckage, as people in the disaster zone begin to sort through what is left of their homes.
I was just flabbergasted, appalled, astounded by what waves could do. You think of water as not a powerful object, but it is. The force of the tidal wave could destroy homes 20, 30 feet high.
It was so long before we could see daylight. It seemed forever. But the first crack of dawn, I said, oh my goodness, where are we? You know? We looked outside and couldn't recognize anything.
The next day, though, when we went back, we saw seaweed and mud everywhere. I mean, it's way high up in the trees.
Florence Kellycoa arrives back near her tattered home, welcomed by a grateful neighbor.
When she finally got to see me, she was just, her hair was green. Deep sea, you know, you smell the deep sea. And she was crying, and I told her, good for you, you want to watch Tsunami, you know? But I had her children. If I didn't take her daughters, they would have all, you know.
Later that day, Florence Kellycoa's husband returns from the sea, grateful to still have a family.
Yeah, tears in his eyes, you know. And he looked at me a long time, and his neighbors, his friends, all was with him who was fishermen, and they were all looking for their families. You know, everybody's looking for their families.
At sea, Fuseo Ito ends an incredible journey.
By morning, she is washed way out at sea, and she's all by herself out there. And she must have made her peace already by that time, because as she tells her story, she said, by that time, she said, it was very beautiful out there in the morning. And as fate would have it, a plane flying over saw someone, the pilot saw something flash in the water, and he reported it to the Coast Guard, and she was rescued.
In the final analysis, 229 homes are destroyed. 308 businesses are obliterated by the floodwaters that permeated nearly 600 acres of Hilo from the harbor inland. Richard Nakamura finds himself with a car lot full of automobiles ravaged by the tsunami.
Once you go to tidal wave, the internal part of the engines, like the engine and transmission, full of sand, full of sand.
The town of Hilo begins the arduous task of rebuilding.
The cleanup of Hilo after the 1960 was a shared cleanup. And because the sugar companies had the large trucks, the large cranes, they took a half of the city of Hilo and did the cleanup.
6 weeks later, Hilo manages to recover from the tsunami. With the rebuilding largely behind them, thoughts now turn to prevention.
What they did was to set up a project called the Kaiko'o Project, Big Wave. And that project involved clearing out all the areas that had been damaged in the 1960 tsunami, saying we can't live there anymore. We're going to make those into soccer fields, parks.
Changes in the warning system are also implemented, including tidal gauges to the south of the island. But more than anything, increased public awareness is seen as the best way to save lives.
They did not have good evacuation zones depicted and available to everyone. Since then, we have corrected that. We've put in a major effort, and evacuation zones have been developed for the coastlines of all our islands, and they're published in the phone book for each county.
Yet the terrifying events of May 22nd linger on, forever emblazoned in the minds of those who lived through it.
On that May 23rd, 1960, life really changed for me. I actually matured overnight. And then all of a sudden, life became so important to me. And so did family.
Anytime we went to somebody's house, the first question I'd ask my mom was, are we safe here? You know, is it within the tsunami, reach of the tsunami? And she would reassure me, oh no, we're far, we're way up. It can't get us here.
And that's an experience I can never forget. When somebody talks about tidal wave, I just listen. And I say to myself, I know what it is. I've been in it. But to be in a dark, where you can't see nothing, just the sounds, it's eerie.
While Hilo had discovered with paralyzing clarity the destruction caused by waters rising from the depths, others a continent away would experience the carnage of waters descending from the heavens. Friday, October 15th, 1954. For the last 3 days, Toronto has been deluged with heavy rainfall. The forecast throughout the weekend, more of the same. Not unusual for that time of year. Over the last 3 days, the 8th tropical hurricane of the year has been ravaging the eastern coastline of the United States. From its origins in the Caribbean, the storm has devastated the island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, leaving behind a death toll in the hundreds. Dubbed Hurricane Hazel, its heavy rains and 200-mile-an-hour winds carve a destructive path northwards. The storm moves inland off the South Carolina coast, heading north. By Friday, October the 15th, Hazel finds itself just south of Toronto.
When people think hurricane in Canada, they think Toronto and Hazel. But Toronto's in the middle of the continent, practically. Hurricanes don't usually affect people in the middle of continents.
Weather officials watch the storm closely, but see no immediate cause for concern. By 6 p.m., an ebbing Hazel is downgraded from a hurricane to a storm as its winds diminish to 70 miles per hour. The worst seems to be over, and Hazel is expected to die out over Lake Ontario within the next 12 hours. That evening, thousands in the Metro Toronto area make their way home for the weekend, including 16-year-old beauty school student Sylvia Jones. She is picked up by her father, who heads back to their new home near Etobicoke Creek in the Humber Valley.
My parents had bought their first house in Canada, and we assumed that things were going to be all for the better for us.
Meteorologists notice a low-pressure system moving in from the west on a collision course with Hazel's remnants.
This dying hurricane, as it came inland with all its moisture, phased with a typical fall storm. They sort of phased right to the south of Toronto, across Pennsylvania, and to the south of Lake Erie. And this caused an explosive deepening of this low-pressure area. And that's the storm that came up over Toronto.
The merging of these two systems prompts weather officials to predict record-breaking rainfall for the Toronto area. They have no idea.
It was raining, the water was coming in the river, but you didn't figure, oh, we got to get out of here. There wasn't that, and there was no warnings. Like a lot of people said, well, why didn't you leave your house and get out? Well, there was no reason to, basically.
A few miles east, off-duty Constable James Crawford of the Metro Toronto Police looks out the window of his house near the Humber River.
I said to my elder brother, jokingly more than anything, let's go over to the Humber. We can make heroes of ourselves tonight. In any event, we drove in my car to the Humber River. But I recall, like it was yesterday, the water was up to the hood of the car. And I thought, geez, we'll be lucky if we can get through this intersection without swamping the spark plugs and going nowhere.
Creeks and rivers immediately flood as the water level in the region literally jumps from the magnitude of the rainfall. Homes and cars become makeshift islands in the rising floodwaters.
Once we got to the Humber River, I was completely flabbergasted by the height that the water had risen to.
Everyone was out, the police, the fire department, the Salvation Army. Citizens were out helping to do whatever they could.
Among the locals is Herb Jones, who brings his motorboat to the river in an effort to aid those stranded in the flood.
Herb Jones asked for a volunteer. I made my way through the crowd, and I says, I'll go with you.
Crawford mans a handheld spotlight, piercing the darkness in search of those in need of aid, as Jones navigates the boat down the river. Very quickly, the two begin to realize that this is more than just a passing flood.
And we started taking people off porches to start with, and then second floor porches after that, and later the roofs of houses.
The swelling floodwaters of the Etobicoke Creek inspire similar feelings of dread in Sylvia's household.
The house was at 2 levels, and the water was up to the step, and we were watching it closely to see if it was going to rise or recede.
But instinct tells residents that the floodwaters are far from receding. If anything, they're growing more intense.
It started coming up, and within a few minutes we're up to a waist in water. But previous to that, my father had taken and put a ladder at the back of the house so we could climb up onto the roof.
The realization begins to sink in that the situation is quickly slipping out of control.
Each time we came back into shore, my brother was there, and he says, "You gonna go back again?" I says, "Yeah, we're going back again." He says, "You're nuts." He says, "You're crazy." He says, "You won't make it. One of these times you're not going to get back." I says, "I know that."
The destructive force of the river becomes more powerful with each passing moment, washing out entire bridges as if they were made of paper.
Inundate houses and break them from their foundations and send them down the river like little toys. I'd never seen anything like that before.
The trailer park above, the water had lifted up the trailers and they were sailing down the road, uprooting trees and hitting the telephone poles.
The worsening conditions make rescue efforts increasingly perilous.
We didn't have time to play around with how we were getting them off the roof and into the boat. If we didn't get them off, we were on our way to Lake Ontario ourselves.
The nightmare inches closer to reality as the house breaks away from its foundation. The woman they're trying to rescue becomes paralyzed with fear.
I said, "Jump or we're not going to make it." She jumped, and I didn't take it as a joke at the time, because she just about took me out of the boat when she landed on me.
Across the street from the Sylvia Jones house, a similar rescue is taking place. Her neighbors, the Thorpe family, realize they won't make it unless they abandon their flooding home. Their pleas for help are answered by members of a local volunteer fire department.
They tied ropes from the hydro lines across from one side of the street to the other side of the street, and they rode across holding on to the rope.
The boat makes its first perilous journey across the raging floodwaters with the youngest of the Thorpe family, Nancy, age 9 months.
The idea was they'd take the baby across the street to our house, and they would go back for the brother and the mother and father. I ended up with her, and then I sat and held her all night on the roof of the house.
But on the return trip to the Thorpe home, the firemen make a horrifying discovery.
when they went back to get the rest of the family, they were all washed away together. But I guess they would wanted to be together, but they all drowned together. Somebody on our roof started to sing, "Bless This House." And they said that this brought them a lot of courage. You know, that you know somebody else was around. 45 years down the road, it still brings back memories.
One person in particular, I remember standing on the roof of the garage. We had a chance to get him off the roof of that garage, waving to us as to which houses contained families, as opposed to him on the roof. I never did know who that was, but he didn't make it.
Only after Jones and Crawford have rescued everyone they can do they finally call it quits. The breaking light of a new day brings with it an end to the terror and a spectrum of mixed emotions.
The voices we had heard from the houses 2 houses away had gone quiet.
Sylvia hands Nancy Thorpe to Red Cross workers who whisk her away to St. Joseph's Hospital for examination, where she is found to be in good health. She's adopted by her grandparents, who, some say wisely, keep her identity a secret. To this day, no one knows the true identity of Nancy Thorpe.
Weren't uprooted by the river. A war zone is a good way to describe it.
In the end, Hurricane Hazel leaves 4,000 homeless across the Metro Toronto area. The damage exceeds $230 million in year 2000 figures, and the death toll reaches 81. As the people of Toronto try to pick up the pieces, conservation authorities look for ways to prevent this from happening again.
We had a lot of cottage development within the valley systems, and particularly at the mouth of the rivers. That's why we had the loss of life that we did.
All these little parks often have little dams that have these little lakes where people can go swimming and boating. All that was built, of course, as a result of all the flooding that occurred with Hazel. They wanted to be able to control the water of the Humber River should a similar event occur.
For some, the memories of Hurricane Hazel have faded with the passage of time. For others, she is impossible to forget.
Starting the day off with a rainstorm, and for it to progress to such a, I mean, who thinks about sitting on the roof of their house? That things have got so bad that you have to keep climbing to get away from the water.
Those people that figure that we've had our hurricane and we'll never have another one are wrong. That we will have one, we will have another one for sure.
While it seems at times incomprehensible, water's ability to destroy all that we hold dear is ever present beneath the hypnotic calmness of its surface. Its life-giving force is just as quickly turned to a life-taking one. It is our respect for this essential element that makes all the difference. As the Hawaiian proverb notes, "Iliki kakai, iakopi opila lilo, ililo no hi havava." Never turn your back on the ocean.